Imagine you went to the doctor because you had a pain in your chest. The doctor prescribes you a pill. You look at the box and read the label. It says, only 25% of people taking this medication feel better. So you ask the doctor, isn't there a better treatment? He shakes his head, no, this is the best treatment we have. Each year, 42 million adults in the US access therapy. That is, roughly speaking, 15 to 16% of the population. And even if we look at the 5 to 17-year-olds, 15% of those have received some sort of mental health treatment. That's a lot of people. But what if I told you that therapy isn't as effective as you've been led to believe? And what if I told you there's specifically one reason it doesn't work? By the way, please subscribe. Well, now. Thanks. Roughly 50% drop out before completion. That is essentially after the first or second session. 25% improve, 15% see no change, and 10% get worse. But what are we even talking about here? I mean, aren't there many different types of therapy? Indeed. So here are the most common types of therapy used in the US. They all vary a little bit in their efficacy, but even though CPT is the strongest and there's most evidence that it works better for some issues than it does for others. So if we zoom out and look at the overall efficacy, it's actually, roughly speaking, the same across all the different therapy types. I hate to admit that, but apparently it's true. The only variable that really makes a difference is the therapist. One meta-analysis found that 5 to 10% of therapists are consistently responsible for the worst outcomes of therapy. That is, some therapists are consistently more effective. The vast majority are mediocre, and a small percentage are consistently harmful. So why is that? Well, here's why the therapist matters more than the specific method. So all the research that's been done into this show that the therapeutic relationship, the alliance between the client and the therapist, is the strongest predictor of outcomes across all therapy types. So if the therapist can't build the sense that there's an alliance between you and her or him, it's not going to work. Personal factors also matter a lot, like warmth, listening skills, and the ability to ask tough questions at just the right time. So these are skills that are very hard to teach, and that also means that there's just going to be a huge difference in how great therapists are at them. And finally, there's the negative therapist effect. It can simply be a poor fit, a lack of empathy, or even the therapist's own personal issues. All these can contribute to making the client's mental health worse. Again, imagine going to the doctor knowing there's a 1 in 10 risk that your health is gonna get worse simply because you were assigned the wrong doctor. Which could be the case, I guess, but let's save that for another time. This is actually extremely sad because it potentially explains the entire negative effect, this 10% of clients who report feeling worse. And maybe some of these therapists are really just toxic people that ought to be in a different profession. You can check my video, What is a Toxic Person, in order to identify toxic people. So it's almost certainly not because there's something wrong with the type of therapy you've been getting. It's more likely that the person is the issue. Okay, so that explains the worst outcomes, but what explains the 50% of people who never come back to their therapist? There's another plot twist hidden here. There is some research looking into why people drop out of therapy early, but it's not perfect. So here's a summation of meta-analyses and large-scale reviews. The problem with these studies is that most of them rely on multiple choice when they gather the data, which unfortunately means that we may not know the actual reasons people drop out of therapy. Their answers are forced to fit into a predetermined box. However, here's where I'm going to go out on a limb. This is a chart of the gender distribution of therapists in the US. The numbers differ a little bit from area to area, but the main takeaway is that roughly 3 in 4 therapists are women. Is that relevant? Well, it can be in some cases. Most treatment facilities ask on their intake forms about the client's gender preference, which they then try to accommodate. And just to be clear, many people experience great results with therapists of the opposite sex. But there are some areas where it's obvious that a strong alliance with the therapist is easier with a therapist of the same sex as you. Actually, surveys show that 30 to 40% of clients have a sex preference for the therapist before they start therapy. That also means that 60 to 70% don't care, which also means that there's almost certainly a good reason when people do ask for a therapist with a specific sex. And that almost certainly has to do with the issue they're seeking help for. And because of the gender distribution of therapists, only 25% men, that means that people requesting men will only get them in no more than 25% of the cases, and maybe even less if there's waiting lists, etc. And this means that there's already a bump in the road in the alliance between the client and the therapist. One Australian survey found that nearly half of everyone who dropped out of therapy early did so because they didn't feel connected with their therapist. And let's remember that it's highly likely that men ask for a male therapist for a reason. So when this is rejected, it may leave guys with the feeling that, well, this therapist, or this clinic rather, isn't really interested in helping me. And this is not to say that women wouldn't have the same experience. I absolutely think they would if all they could get was a male therapist. But as the landscape looks right now, it's just a fact that the gender distribution of therapists makes it impossible for the majority of males to get a male therapist. So maybe this is a missing piece to the puzzle about why men feel worse mental health-wise now than ever before. And if you're interested in these issues, I want to invite you to join Heart Love Theory over on School. Link for that below. So what's the takeaway here? I want to say that I'm a big fan of therapy. If I had no financial constraints whatsoever, I'd probably find myself a really great therapist and see him or her twice a week. Also, we didn't really focus on the 25% of people who experienced no improvement or worsening. But people can actually get better without feeling better. I knew a guy who hated his therapist, but he kept going for years. So maybe he did get something out of it. But if you're matched with a therapist that you have bad chemistry with, you probably should cut the collaboration short. Worst case scenario, this could be one of those therapists that actually make you feel worse. Also, therapy is wrapped in many of the same drapings as a visit to the doctors. So we probably think it's a little more hard science than it actually is. In reality, it is as personal and messy as any human relationship, meaning you're not going to get anything out of it until you find a person you trust. And maybe this is a message for the therapists who may be watching this. Please keep in mind that people who seek your help do so because their feelings are overwhelming. That doesn't mean that their feelings are wrong, even though you may feel they are. You literally can't help anyone if you're judging them, secretly or openly. Thanks for listening.